The modern organizational ideal relies on perfect standardization, standardized hiring rubrics, rigid pay for performance formulas, and fixed tenure clocks. We call this formal neutrality. It is the legal and corporate standard, where the exact same criteria are applied in the exact same way to every single individual. Yet, despite decades of utilizing these perfectly neutral systems, they continuously output deeply skewed gender results. This chart visualizes data from sociologists Young-Ju Cha and Kim Whedon, tracking the gender wage gap. It reveals a massive and widening disparity, specifically among workers supplying 50-plus hours a week. Consider the academic tenure clock, a formally identical 6-year timeline to publish and secure tenure. But this neutral timeline interacts with the realities of early childbearing, resulting in disproportionate female attrition in that exact window. The prevailing corporate assumption is that if a rule is blind to gender, its outcomes must inherently be gender-blind too. A perfectly neutral rule does not eliminate bias, it merely obscures the structural preconditions required to succeed under that rule. Formal neutrality is not a reflection of fairness, it is a specific kind of accounting artifact. This accounting artifact does not fail randomly. It produces systemic inequality through two distinct compounding variables. The first is counting invisibility. Systems fail because they refuse to measure the external labor required to meet their baseline inputs. The second is status belief perturbation. Even when baseline inputs are identical, evaluators subconsciously warp that data based on the system's framing. These two mechanisms are completely independent of one another. Their effects compound rather than substitute. They do not happen alongside a neutral rule. They are actively shielded and enabled by the rule's claim of perfect objectivity. Sociologist Joan Acker established that organizational rules are built around an abstract worker, an employee assumed to have no bodily needs, no sick children, and no home obligations. This ideal worker is not a natural baseline. It is a description of a person whose daily survival and care needs are being met invisibly by someone else. Feminist economics explains this structural gap. A wage covers only the worker's output. The day-to-day reproduction of that worker is assumed to be entirely free. In 1988, Marilyn Waring critiqued the system of national accounts underlying GDP, showing it explicitly excluded unpaid household production from being counted as economic output. Waring's macroeconomic critique applies directly to the microeconomics of the corporation. Standard job descriptions and career ladders hard-code this unmeasured labor into their demands. Organizations are not simply ignoring care labor. They are structurally dependent on its free extraction to make their neutral rules function. If the organizational baseline requires an unmeasured subsidy, we have to look at who is actually paying it. This ledger visualizes time use data from the International Labor Organization. While the formal ledger tracks paid outputs, the shadow ledger measures unpaid care work, revealing that women perform this labor at roughly 3 times the rate of men globally. Sociologist Arlie Hochschild documented this as the second shift. For employed women, this externalized labor doesn't vanish, it is simply performed twice. This brings us back to the wage gap among overworkers. A compensation structure that demands 50 continuous hours a week inherently penalizes anyone carrying the shadow ledger at home. Because the precondition required to meet the rule, unlimited availability, is unequally distributed, the rule acts as a structural filter, not a neutral scale. But what happens when an employee does have unlimited availability and meets all identical inputs? Does the system evaluate them equally? An audit study by Correll, Bernard, and Pike tested this by sending matched, identical resumes to real job openings. They altered only one detail: a parent-teacher association membership on a single resume. Despite identical inputs, mothers received drastically lower competence ratings and salary recommendations. Fathers with the exact same resume received a bonus. This is status belief perturbation. Evaluators are applying a different rule. They are applying the same rule while subconsciously supplying different priors about who is competent. Emilio Castilla examined this mechanism inside organizations that explicitly label their systems as meritocratic. He documented the Paradox of Meritocracy. Formal declarations of fairness actually increase managerial bias by lowering evaluators' guard against their own subjectivity. Formal neutrality fails to stop bias, and under specific conditions actively weaponizes a false sense of fairness to enable it. This structural logic, where neutral rules cause unequal effects, was regecked. A neutral rule, acting on an unequal precondition, leads to disproportionate exclusion. It explicitly bypasses the need for discriminatory intent. The exact same logic applies to organizational gender rules. An unequally distributed precondition converts neutral wording into systemic inequality. Intent to discriminate is not required to build an exclusionary system. Institutional ignorance of a rule's baseline requirements is entirely sufficient. Standard HR solutions, like implicit bias training or editing the wording of a job description, fail to solve either the invisible ledger or the evaluator's lens. Theorist Bell Hooks diagnosed this specific failure. Adding marginalized people to existing structures doesn't work if you leave the structural requirements untouched. Legal scholar Sandra Friedman established the required alternative. Substantive equality requires altering the foundational environment to reflect structural reality, rather than enforcing identical treatment at unequal starting depths. Fixing the ledger requires internal cost accounting that treats predictable care-related absences as planned organizational costs, not individual deviations. Fixing the lens requires active, ongoing bias auditing of outcomes to replace the blind trust generated by the meritocracy label. Formal neutrality is not the absence of bias. It is the exact engineered condition under which systemic unfairness becomes impossible to see from inside the machine.